Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast from Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, join historians Iain Macgregor and Sinclair McKay for an insightful discussion on the aftermath of World War II and how its impact still governs global affairs today. Recorded live at the 2025 festival, this episode offers a compelling analysis of the war's long shadow on global affairs.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Bradford Literature Festival on, sadly, its last day for the year, but look forward to seeing everybody back next year as well. And thank you for being out relatively early on a Sunday for some. Except coming from Detroit, seeing the sun going up at 4 o'clock in the morning is a little bit different. We have a wonderful session today on Aftermath, how World War II still governs global affairs with two true experts in this field. So to my right and your left, we have Sinclair McKay, who is the Sunday Times bestselling author of Meeting Churchill, Berlin at Dresden, The Secret Life of Bletchley Park, The Secret Listeners, Bletchley Park Brain Teasers. Oh, that sounds like fun.
It is.
I see, and I thought you were an enigma. And The Mile End Murder.
It's too early in the morning.
It's too early in the Sinclair is also a literary critic for The Mail on Sunday and The Spectator, and lives in London. Probably the most important thing that you live in. To my left and your right is Iain Macgregor. He's a British historian, author, editor, and public speaker, not to be confused with Obi-Wan Kenobi. That would be a different Iain Macgregor. Renowned for his in-depth explorations of 20th century military history. With almost 3 decades of non-fiction publishing, he has collaborated with prominent historians such as Simon Schama, Max Hastings, and Michael Wood. His acclaimed books include Checkpoint Charlie, an oral history of Cold War Berlin, and The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, which delves into the pivotal World War II battle. Macgregor's writing has been featured in The Guardian, The Spectator, BBC History Magazine, and The Washington Post. I'm also here to show that not only are their latest offerings here on the table, but they will be available for a book signing in the Festival Hub with the Waterstones pop-up book, Sinclair's latest, St. Petersburg, Sacrifice and Redemption in the City That Defied Hitler, and Iain's book, The Hiroshima Man, Quest to Build the Atomic Bomb, and the Fateful Decision to Use It. Welcome, Sinclair and Iain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So what I thought we would do is offer you each a chance to shamelessly promote your, or shamefully or shamelessly, either way, I'm not judging, a little bit about your book, because I think it provides a fascinating on-ramp to the topic at hand about why World War II still governs global affairs. And maybe within that, if you could also ask, did World War II actually ever end?
That's the kind of really big question we really love on a Sunday morning. And you're absolutely right. In philosophical terms, did it ever really end? Because for many, many people in many different parts of the world, it didn't. The conflict rolled on and rolled on like thunder cracking across a valley. Actually, in terms of World War II in my book, St. Petersburg, the most immediate thing that I would mention is that Vladimir Putin is St. Petersburg's most infamous son at the moment. He was born in what was then Leningrad in 1952. His own parents, Putin's own parents, had suffered atrociously during the siege of Leningrad, which went on from the autumn of 1941 to the beginning of 1944. It was 900 days and nights where the Wehrmacht, the Nazi forces, completely encircled the city in the northwest of Russia, completely encircled it with the aim not of conquest, but of extermination. They just simply wanted to wipe out everyone in Leningrad, the 2 million odd inhabitants. And they cut off all the supply lines, road, rail, which meant that very, very, very little food could be flown in. People started to starve to death, and there are thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands in the space of one horrific winter. And those who didn't starve to death were killed by disease. And this had all been planned out in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Putin's mother lost a 2-year-old child, Victor, who would have been Putin's older brother, had he not died in the early months of 1942. And Putin's own mother came so close to death herself that her body was taken out of the apartment block and taken to the corpse collection point that they had at the end of her street in Leningrad, because there were so many dead bodies, they had to be put in mass graves. There was not enough ground to accommodate the dead. She was placed with a number of other bodies. She wasn't dead. A neighbor spotted her feet twitching just in time, and she was pulled out from this body. She recovered. But what that does to someone for the rest of their lives, I have no. But Putin was born in 1952, and Putin, ever since then, has constantly, every single year, he goes back to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, for the commemoration of the siege, which is marked with huge ceremonies of remembrance. And you can see him on YouTube. He speaks with genuine fury about what happened there. So it's not explaining Putin at all, because if the many thousands of people were born in Leningrad in 1952, and they didn't grow up to become despotic, genocidal warmongers. So we can't, that's the cause and effect doesn't quite work. But nonetheless, he invokes World War II the entire time. And this nightmare campaign that we're seeing in Ukraine now, and all the possibilities that he keeps teasingly throwing out about the sphere of influence of Russia and how the Baltic states should be part of Greater Russia again, and what constitutes what he would call the Russian world. This is all very heavily influenced by the shadow of World War II.
I mean, how can you escape that as part of your biography? I mean, the whole idea about being, especially at a very formative age, and in this case, dealing with a mother who was almost dead, and the loss of an older brother. I mean, from a psychological term alone, I mean, it's so heavy. And we've seen other examples of this. I mean, Roger Waters, his entire musical career was shaped by really two things. One was World War II, and the other was, of course, Syd Barrett, and the trauma of his issues in the band. So it seems as though it's a continuing trespass on the psyche.
Yes, and yet, again, to widen that out, we focus on Putin, but in the 1970s, the 1980s, there were psychologists in Leningrad who went to conduct a study of all the survivors of the siege, those who contributed memoirs and diaries to the archives, which are still there today, just extraordinary. They encouraged people to write their diaries and memoirs. And psychologists caught up with survivors decades later, expecting to find stories of deep-seated trauma. And yes, there were people who said that they always felt hungry. Despite having all the food they needed, they always felt that hunger. They always felt that fear of hunger. Some still felt cold after several decades, even in summer. But what they also found, slightly to their own surprise, was a slightly higher degree of empathy than you would normally find in any large collection of people. That actually, for a number of survivors, the horrors of the siege, and then having survived the siege, there was guilt, and obviously there was the horror and the trauma of losing loved ones. But at the same time, there was also a sharpened appetite for the brightness of humanity too, that the authorities found. Now, you imagine the 1970s Russian authorities, you wouldn't expect psychologists to go, and they, I think, were quite surprised. So,
but they had been in an existential fight for survival as a country.
Yes.
So I think that plays into it as well.
Yes.
So
yes,
as in they survived.
Yes.
And they beat this almost Death Star-like force that was a genocidal campaign.
That was intent upon exterminating them all.
I think that's where the light's from, as in we survived.
Yes.
Even though 27 million people perished. So.
Yes.
So now, if you are going to invoke the Death Star, people really are going to think you're the other Iain McGregor.
Yeah, sorry. Well, at several points in the talk, I will invoke the Death Star.
Okay, very good. Well, what I really appreciate here is that, I mean, Sinclair, your book focuses on the European theater of the war, and Iain, yours focuses on the Pacific theater.
Yeah, but it's driven, as some of you may know, I mean, the Manhattan Project is driven by an existential, or you could say real fear that the Nazis would have the atomic bomb first. So that's what sets in train President Roosevelt signing off the Manhattan Project. And that's why they're on this race. I mean, it literally is a race to coalesce American industry and whatever, a lot of them are from Europe, like Szilard, the Hungarian physicist. They've got the cream of the scientific community in Los Alamos, but not just in Los Alamos, right across the country. The Manhattan Project employed about 120,000 people. But yeah, you're right. My book focuses more on the Pacific, and I was going to say, even though it can be termed military history, but what I've said in a lot of talks, because it was deliberately what I wanted to do, and it invokes what we're talking about today with the title of the talk, it's about emotion and memory. It's how we, as an audience, we have several different perspectives, I would imagine, on is it right, is it moral to use an atomic bomb on human beings? What do we think about the actual dropping of the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima compared to how we see it today? What do we think is going to happen today? And like I said, I mean, I've done 3 years of research in both the Japanese and American archives. And some of the things I've put in the book, you might scratch your chin and think, okay, I'd need to delve deeper into that to agree with the conclusions the author's saying. But for instance, I came away from seeing the research of American forces and Japanese forces, how the civilian governments both looked at fighting, prosecuting the war. And my conclusion was it's an enormous race riot in the Pacific. I mean, that's what we're looking at here. It's both sides demonize one another to the nth degree on the same scale as the Eastern Front. It's literally a war to the bitter end of which racial group is going to come out on top. And not just so much Japanese against Americans, Japanese against Filipinos, Japanese against Burmese, Japanese against Thais, Japanese against North Koreans, and Japanese against China. China lost 15 million civilians in the Second World War, and that doesn't really get addressed very much to an English-speaking audience, I should say. So I do talk about you can really chart why it's logical, and that's not me saying it's logical. I'm saying that you could see why an American administration, by the time you're getting to 1945 and this story arc of brutality in the Pacific, it's a natural consequence to think, let's use an atomic bomb.
I'd like to get back to China and Japan a little bit later, because in many ways, I mean, Japan invades Manchuria in 1931, the rape of Nanking happens in 1937. One has to wonder about Chinese economic policy and some of its flexing of its muscles today across the Sea of Japan as being related to that. But let's go back to May 1945. We find the German surrender in the European theater. August 1945, we find the Japanese surrender. So the war, and I'll use this with inverted commas, ends in the form of the defeat by the Axis powers. Mussolini was already hanging upside down.
Yes.
But the whole idea then that how does the world order shift? Is that the point? Or does it shift at Yalta before that, when Roosevelt is alive, meeting with Uncle Joe Stalin and with Churchill? Where are we going in this whole idea of the post-war era?
I mean, in a sense, it did shift there because the idea of ceding so much of Europe to Stalin, basically saying this is now yours, Poland is now yours, the Baltic states are now yours. And the consequences this had for millions of displaced people, refugees right the way across Europe who, as you say, the war ended, but for them, the war really didn't end. There were people still in camps 2 years later who were refusing to leave the camps because they did not want to be deported to what was now absolutely inextricably Stalin's Russia, with all the attendant terrors that brought. And so many of these displaced people had been prisoners of wars who had been fighting for the Red Army. Thousands upon thousands of whom would then be sent to the Gulag afterwards, simply for having been fraternizing with the enemy. Yes, I mean, the treaties could be signed, peace could be signed, but for just untold millions of people, the misery continued and continued, as then the Soviet Empire was consolidated across Eastern Europe. So yes, the geopolitics changes just at the point when America steps up to be this brand new superpower.
Yeah. I think Potsdam is the Potsdam Conference, June, July, in Germany. Germany's defeated. You've got a new president who's awestruck, turning up because now he's in front of Churchill, who he's admired to the nth degree, Stalin, who he fears but respects, and Truman was senator from Missouri. He was vice president, but Roosevelt kept him out of many of the key meetings, didn't know about the Manhattan Project until he became president. But it's at Potsdam that I think the shutters come down for Truman, and he sees what he's up against. As you're saying, he's not going to shift the Red Army from Central Europe. They've lost Poland. They're hoping they won't lose Czechoslovakia, huge chunk of Germany, Romania, Hungary. But there's a threat there, and I think it distills into American foreign policy in the Pacific, because there is an argument that there is that's one of the reasons that plays out for why they dropped the bomb, because by the time the Japanese are going to surrender or are looking to collapse anyway in August, that's where Stalin's, or as had been agreed, he had agreed it with Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta, that the Red Army would volte-face and move eastwards. I just don't think the Allies expected he would do it as quickly as he did. So, before the bombings of Hiroshima, there's 1.5 million Soviet troops on the Manchurian border ready to invade. There's this argument about, they would have taken Japan, and I really don't see that at all. It might come up in one of the questions you were going to ask, but I've said this in talks already. Yes, the Russians were going to take a big chunk of Manchuria, and they could have threatened other areas on the mainland. But for the Red Army to then get across to the Japanese home islands, they would have needed a fleet twice as big as the fleet that invaded Europe for D-Day, and they didn't have it. And even then, once they got on the homelands, why would it be so different for the casualties the Russians would have to endure as the Americans would? The Americans were absolutely scared stiff that if we invade the homeland, we're going to take 1 million casualties. It's the same for the Russians.
Well, there's this irony that on the one hand, perhaps the Soviet Union thought about invading Japan for retribution for really suffering a humiliating defeat in 1905 with the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah.
At the same time, ironically, there would not be a Soviet Union were it not for that defeat in 1905. The revolution may never have occurred.
Yes.
So talk about mixed signals as to what to do. So you mentioned Harry Truman, and he started off as a haberdasher in Missouri. I mean, he sold clothing. I mean, that was his thing. And from the looks of how he dressed, he probably should have shopped somewhere else. But you're going from now, America once and for all has to drop its isolationism.
Yes.
This is the moment where, to borrow from music, like Dylan would say, America goes electric.
Yeah.
And now it has gone into a phase of internationalism, in part because of Stalin, or at least the fears of this expansion. How does that then shape the world with the introduction on the world stage of America?
There are so many kind of elements of both sides trying to understand each other psychologically as well as geopolitically. There's the flashpoint in 1949 of the Berlin blockade. There's still an extraordinary idea that Berlin, the city we now all know, was deep within what had become the GDR. Basically, the East Germany, part of the Soviet kind of empire. And within this, there is this kind of enclave, Berlin, which is cut in half. You've got East Berlin, which is solidly communist, West Berlin, which belongs to, basically is run by the Americans, the British, and the French just after the war, in the years immediately after the war. And this is before the Berlin Wall. So it's still perfectly possible to cross from east to west. It's like crossing over between different dimensions as both ideologies kind of square up to each other in this extraordinary city, which is the kind of crucible in many ways of that kind of mid-20th century post-war trauma. Then in 1949, Stalin makes the eccentric decision that he's going to blockade West Berlin, because the idea of having this beacon of American hegemony within his own territory is absolutely intolerable. So we get rather like the echoes of the siege of Leningrad. They close the railway lines, they close the roads. There's only one way to get supplies in, and that's by air. And then so we see the extraordinary thing of the Berlin airlift, where planes basically coming in, following each other in a matter of seconds, going on for weeks and weeks and months. But all the while, as I say, both sides trying to fathom one another. And then in 1949, thanks in part to the atomic physicist Klaus Fuchs, who's been working at Los Alamos, who fervently believes that the Soviets should have the atomic secrets too, Stalin is able to detonate his first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan in 1949. And that's, again, where everything starts to, this new world starts to solidify. But it's still a world under the shadow of war.
But I think you've got a vacuum in terms of power and personality at the end of the war, because the great leaders have gone. Other than Stalin, they've gone. So Churchill loses the election, Roosevelt's dead, you've got Truman, who's still finding his feet, but Stalin's still there. And then in terms of power, the British Empire's crumbling. So we're withdrawing because we can't afford to run it. We just don't have the manpower or the finance.
Yeah.
When you've got a vacuum like that, who's going to step up? So there were huge elements still within America, politically and socially, that had obviously gone under the rug during the war. They had been there. You know, there's big well, there is today, but there was a big right-wing element before the war that were doing almost fascist marching rallies in Chicago. They're still there, but it's the Truman. I admire Truman because he's a pragmatist, and I think he probably would have liked to have withdrawn to a greater degree than expand, definitely. But he realizes that there is a vacuum. He also realizes that within months, he's got a problem with the Soviets, I should call them. And that's why he famously berates Molotov when he comes over, saying, what the hell are you doing in Greece, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia? I mean, he tears him a new one, shall we say. And Molotov says, I've never been spoken to like that before. And he said, well, if you actually adhere to your agreements, i.e. Potsdam, this wouldn't happen. And Truman is a Europhile, you could say, because he'd seen action in the Great War. He'd been an artillery officer. So he understands the power of artillery and TNT, which is why he was thinking, wow, I've got a single bomb that's got the equivalent of 20,000 tons of TNT. It can wipe out a city. So he had that in his back pocket as well. So the reason why I admire Truman is not because ultimately, as the film does show, the buck stops with him. He said, use the bomb. It's the fact that I do think he's more of a visionary than Roosevelt was. Roosevelt tried to save and rebuild the country that had suffered from the Great Depression, whereas Truman saw or maybe he listened more to American industry to say, there is an opportunity here for global economic dominance if we get it right. Hence, he ushers in the Marshall Plan.
And Eisenhower's quote of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, and he doesn't stop it.
Which happens at the end of his term. By the way, anyone in a bow tie can be pretty scary. So, so the war ends, and now you have on the world stage, you have leaders, and I think you're absolutely right. So you have one phase of leaders out, but you have Eisenhower in the United States from 52 to 60. You have Khrushchev in 53 until 69 after Stalin dies. Yeah. And then you have
the return of Churchill in 1951.
You have the return of Churchill. You have de Gaulle. But de Gaulle, Khrushchev, and Eisenhower all were major military figures in World War II. So it seems as though that lens by which they see the future after World War II, assuming it ended, really is very pivotal.
I always see Khrushchev as almost like a jilted boyfriend. He wanted to be friends with the West because he knew that obviously the country's on its knees and he needs as much backing and support as possible. He knew this. It's not in his interests to be paying, half the country's GDP in keeping an army in Central Europe, millions of them. And he would have given up Germany. He would have given up Berlin if they demilitarized the whole country, because that's their big that's their big elephant in the room. We don't want to militarize Germany ever again. There were some Americans who wanted to just turn it into one big piece of farmland. And
the Morgenthau Plan, yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I always see Khrushchev, he did initially he survived a madhouse. He was just the last guy left standing from Stalin's murderous regime. So he's probably blinking into the sunlight thinking, wow, I'm running the country and I'm alive. But I think he did. He thought he could have an international relationship with Eisenhower. Hence, he went to America and did the big tour and built himself a bit of a reputation as almost like the lovable Red. But then the Marshall Plan was slowly wrecking that. And with American entry into Europe en masse militarily, he's thinking, well, I can't move the Red Army anymore.
Yes, and that takes us close to the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything before that, the Jupiter. And again, there's both sides trying to read each other, trying to kind of understand each other, as if they couldn't still quite completely fathom one another's motives.
Khrushchev was a very, very chaotic leader.
Yeah.
I mean, what side of the bed do you get up in the morning, decide who you're going to invade, or who you're going to, or do you build a wall in Berlin? It's you can't. Where it's such a militarized situation, where
even the building
both sides
of that wall, they handed out they handed out rations of brandy to the men who were building the wall itself. Chocolate, the hot chocolate and brandy was what they were given. As this wall went up, and it's a matter of days, the original improvised version of it. So the chaos kind of permeates all the way down. Really, there's extemporization.
So I'd say the world in a nuclear holocaust was probably, I would say, Early 60s under Khrushchev, and then early 80s, where every other Russian leader kept dying of old age, and you don't know who's going to be in charge.
What was it? I think
They're
it
the
was
two pinch
Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko were dropping like that.
Yeah,
Now, see, if Trump would have offered chocolate and brandy to build the southern wall, that would have gone up. That would have gone differently. But you know, Eisenhower has something else. He has the Dulles brothers, who see the world in very binaristic terms. So John Foster is Secretary of State, and you have Allen over across the Potomac at the CIA. Mm-hmm. And they see anybody who is not on the American side of the ledger as problematic and really almost by default pro-Soviet. So the idea that Khrushchev, as you said, he was a jilted boyfriend, but he found love with a washing machine in America. Mm-hmm. I mean, he fell in love with that. But we're also forgetting, I think, another important thing. You mentioned Berlin, 1949. This is also the start of the civil war in China. And Mao Zedong is coming on the world stage. And the reason I bring this up is that after Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping comes into power. Yeah. And Deng Xiaoping has a similar view as Khrushchev of trying to warm up to the West, comes to the United States for investment, feted by President Carter, made to wear a stupid 10-gallon hat in Houston at the rodeo and the livestock show. But he sets the seeds for people like Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, and perhaps most prominently Xi Jinping right now. So the rest of the world was taking certain lessons from the World War II paradigm to get to this point.
Yeah, again, I only found this out the research, that when the Americans started their B-29 bombing campaign over Japan, it was a certain Mao Zedong was giving them weather reports. And because his bases were the closest to the Japanese home islands, the Americans couldn't get there because he's up in the mountains. But in return for American military investment, and we're talking tons and tons of equipment, he would give them weather reports. Because of the jet stream over the Japanese home islands made it impossible for the Americans to accurately gauge which way to approach for their bombing raids. But that's what I found ironic and humorous, was Mao was very, very invested in American military support all the way through those early years of the Civil War, which then obviously got massively bigger after the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, but sorry, yes, I was also going to say, but in the case of China, then there is also it's very much invoked now, because China, rather like Putin in Russia, is very, very interested in the use of history in order to, well, I suppose we all do it in a certain sense, even if we don't know we're doing it, but Putin is very, very conscious. In China, it's conscious too. It reaches back further than World War II to the history of colonialism and Western colonialism, and the fact that China had suffered so terribly at the turn of the century. From the Boxer Rebellion, the British and the Germans behaving just with appalling kind of savagery and atrocity, but none of this forgotten, and all of this kind of remembered. And Xi Jinping is very keen that everything should be remembered. Everything that the West has done should be remembered.
Well, all the while, I was going to say, through the Cold War, you've got two big communist blocs, Soviet Union and China. Their leadership have survived, grown up with the threat we're going to get annihilated by the Western capitalist powers. I mean, that's educated them in their foreign policy and how they suppress at home. And then it's our governments, how do we deal with these people?
Yeah.
So getting into the mind of Putin then, when he sees after the end of the Cold War, so to speak, Western shifting into the former Warsaw Pact countries.
Yeah.
As you said before, after World War II, the West said, okay, Stalin, you can have Poland, you can have all of these. And now it seems as though there's been a retraction going into Poland. East Germany is reunified with West Germany.
Yeah.
Former Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, all of the
Baltic states, all with their own.
Well, Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union, but all of the Warsaw Pact that won all the medals at Olympic Games for a long time.
Yeah.
And that was one line that was breached. And then now we have with Ukraine, not the Warsaw Pact, but former Soviet republics, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and then for an attempt, a tryst to try to bring Georgia over. So we find then that the old world order, from the standpoint of Putin, is seeing it as an encroachment that's no different than the breach of the Molotov-Ribbentrop plan in 1941.
Yes, it's so interesting what he appears to be trying to do. I mean, he wrote, I think just before the invasion of Ukraine, he wrote a 15,000-word essay which he very kindly made available on his own presidential website, so we can all go and read it today. And it does make for fascinating reading, because he's setting it out, rather like Mein Kampf, Hitler's prospectus from the 1920s, where Hitler said, once we've conquered Western Europe, we will turn our gaze to the east, and we will basically invade Russia. There were no secrets. There was no secret what he planned to do. And Putin, to a certain extent, can fetishize this history. Because he's very concerned with what he sees as the Russian world. And his Russian world is basically the post-1945 post-war order. His Russian world extends deep into Europe. It certainly extends to the Baltic States, and it certainly extends to Ukraine, which he said in that essay, we will just simply be like the EU, perhaps closer economically than the EU, but we are like sovereign nations, but we are all one people. And then he goes on to quote Dostoevsky, saying that what people never understand about Russia and the Russian people is the depth, the hidden depth of their unity. He sees, he's setting out for his people this vision of the Russian world, but it is very much based on the post-war era that he himself enjoyed as a young KGB officer in the city of Dresden, which was then part of the GDR, East Germany. He was there in the early 1980s, and it's fantastic to see pictures of him in the early 1980s now, because that's the only time when he grew a little tubby, because the Dresden beer was so delicious, he couldn't keep away with it. But that to him was the world order. This was a city in which he, as a young KGB officer, was sovereign over the German people, sovereign over that part of Europe. Then suddenly all of this is snatched away in a riptide of history that apparently no one could see coming. He himself had to set fire to all sorts of Stasi papers in Dresden overnight. The tidal wave overcame them. And so Leningrad is one thing, actually, but it's the fall of the wall and the collapse of communism in Putin's mind. It's like, for him, it's like having a limb amputated, I suppose. Well, this constant twitch.
There's just constant ripple effects from the Soviet Union falling, and it becomes the Wild West. Oligarchs take over, Putin ushers them in, rides that wave because...
And makes a great deal of money out of it.
Enhances his own wealth. And I can see that going on for decades. Yeah. I mean, they've stripped the country bare.
Yeah. Well, how convenient for a fan of Dostoevsky like Putin that he has an idiot to work with now.
But what we discussed last time, we were talking about the main question is, if I was Zelensky, I'd be kicking myself thinking, why did we give up our nuclear weapons, our nuclear shield in '94 and the Budapest
the Budapest Memorandum? Yeah. Well, this is part of, I don't know if it's a deception as much as it is an illusion, but how much of that do you think has to do with some of the institutions that were established after World War II or in the process? You've got the United Nations, and you've got NATO, to which there's the counter force of the Warsaw Pact. And today, it seems as though, depending on which Sunday morning pundit we listen to in the US or the UK or other places, the shelf life of the United Nations is being questioned. I have a president back home who questions the viability of NATO. Is it the organizations themselves that are in fact sclerotic? Or is it the architecture of the fact that we no longer live in a World War II paradigm?
Or is it just simply that they're evolving? I mean, the United Nations is still there, and it's just simply evolving. It used to be American-dominated. Now it's increasingly dominated by Russia and China on most of those committees. So it's still there, but the influence is shifting, and it's shifting precisely eastwards, actually. I mean, that's where the center of gravity is going, and that's why I think, in terms of the shadow of World War II, and the shadow particularly of the atomic bomb, and what kind of future of a non-future the atomic bomb kind of raises. I mean, you mentioned last that China itself has acquired. Do you know how many nuclear warheads there are still in the world? So 12,000?
12,500 nuclear warheads right now, of which about 2,500 are actively live in missiles, ready to roll, predominantly with America. It's mainly Russia and America have got about 90% of those 2,500 that are active. Yeah. America's got most of them. And then the rest is China. China's making about 100 nuclear warheads a year. But getting back to your question, my main worry is if you start stripping away the authenticity and of the United Nations, international agreements. So, for instance, the big American-Russian agreement sat where both sides would slowly, year upon year, de-escalate how many nuclear warheads each of them had in their arsenals. and they're allowed to monitor each other and what new ones are coming online. So they're sharing technology, so there's no surprises. Key thing is both sides don't want surprises. That next February, that agreement's gone. It's ended its 10-year duration. I have seen no news that both sides are going to be sitting down to renegotiate a treaty, and that's the worry, because if then they can then escalate, the other 7 countries around the world, North Korea, France, Britain, China, Israel, I'm trying to remember the rest of them now.
India, Pakistan.
India and Pakistan.
What does that say to them? You're giving everyone the green light. Like, if we're not agreeing, the rest of you can go on too.
But the world is still in a position where it appears to be up to America to decide whether Iran is allowed to have nuclear weaponry or not.
Yep, exactly. It's almost like this is, well, they're the big bully in the playground. They decide who's got the power. I mean, that's what this is about. It's not for the good of the world.
And Iran has its own World War II shadows and post-World War II shadows with the Mossadegh and the CIA involvement and oil and all those kind of shenanigans. So again, the ripple effects and the resentment, the historical resentment caused.
I was saying to Sinclair last night, a weird human connection to all this is Colonel Paul Tibbets flew the Enola Gay to drop the world's first atomic bomb. And then his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV, actually commanded the very first B-2 stealth bombers that went into combat in 1999 over Kosovo. And then he was in command of the whole unit for the next 3 or 4 years.
So he was a Nepo baby.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, but we see this happening elsewhere. In 1943, the American who was in charge of the supply lines through Iran to the Soviet Union was a man by the name of Schwarzkopf. And then, of course, we have... See, sometimes I can actually teach them something. But you have then, of course, in Desert Storm, his son, Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, who's leading the American coalition that's going on there.
If America withdraws so much from international governance, that's where you get the issues where what happens with the latest skirmish between India and Pakistan. I mean, India was firing cruise missiles at one point, until they obviously got a rap on the knuckles from the State Department. But again, that's probably I see that as the main pinch point in the world right now. Not America bombing Iran, it's India, Pakistan at the moment.
And, well, you see this coordination between Pakistan and China when it comes to the technology and picking off planes, French planes, from the sky at a distance of about 200 kilometers. But the UN Security Council has 5 permanent members with veto power, which is the US, the UK, France, now China. The China seat was different at its inception of the UN, and of course Russia. That is about as post-World War II as you can get.
Yeah.
And despite certain efforts to try to change this, of course, no one wants to give up the veto power, and no one wants to add anyone to the 5. And so in many ways, we are, it seems, stuck back in World War II when it comes to what should be ostensibly a very important international institution.
That's a worry in itself. Once you get, there's another, below the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons right now, there's easily about another dozen that will have nuclear weapons in the next 10 years. And we haven't even talked about dirty bombs. What's the danger there? So I did a talk with Professor Frank Close, who's one of the country's most eminent physicists. We did a talk last week together, whereas I talked about the human element, he talked about the science. And his talk afterwards with me over a cup of coffee, I needed whiskey in the coffee afterwards, because he just scared the hell out of me about talking about this, as in the technology and the application you would need to create a dirty bomb isn't that far away. And that's the scary thing too.
Well, I think that actually, not to make you more depressed, and I mean, it is still early on a Sunday to be drinking, but the idea that, as far as I know, the only country that's dropped or the atomic bomb is the United States twice, but has also used dirty bombs, which they don't call them dirty bombs, but it's called depleted uranium in a place like Iraq. So that material is still out there. Well, before we turn it to the audience, which I know I can tell has some really excellent questions, I want to just end with these 2 questions. Can we move beyond World War II? And do we really want to move beyond World War II?
I think we can, and I think I mean, to give a slightly unrelated example, I was in Dresden last February for the 80th anniversary, the commemoration of the bombing of Dresden that happened in 1945. And it was at that the city authorities, it's a huge, tremendously solemn occasion every year, incredibly moving. But on this occasion, on the 80th anniversary, the city authorities have said, we will continue to mark it, but not in such a big way anymore, because it's starting to leave living memory. And I slightly wonder this about St. Petersburg and about Leningrad. You know, so I've said that Putin goes back every year for the commemorations where they put pieces of bread on mass graves to symbolize the hardship and the horror that people went through. But when it leaves living memory, the power of that somehow fades. So maybe the part of the turmoil in the world at the moment is precisely because
I was going to say the
we're
exact
moving
same thing.
Yeah.
Then it's a generational shift, and it hasn't happened yet.
Well, I also see the power of the 100, and in 20 years we'll be marking the 100th anniversary of the end of World War II. I'd like to see what in 2046 the momentum is. I remember a few years ago the movie 1917, no, was it 1917? No, I'm sorry, Dunkirk came out.
Okay.
And my middle daughter, who at the time was, I think, probably about 17 years old, she said, "Hey, Bob, I want to go see Dunkirk with you." I'm like, "Why?" And she says, "It looks like a really good movie." And I said, "Do you know what it's about?" She said, "Yeah, it's a movie about war." I said, "Okay, which war?" And she's now fumbling. And I said, "Let me help you out. It's World War I." "Oh, that's my favorite war." And I'm like, I didn't realize people had a favorite war. And then I realized that the reason why she was so passionate about wanting to go see the movie was because Harry Styles was in it.
There you go.
Which made it her favorite movie, and it made World War I her favorite war.
That's an excellent reason.
It's worrying. The trouble is like you mentioned Oppenheimer at the start of the talk. Right. I was in Japan doing the research when the film came out. Yes, it's a good film to a certain degree. It captures his character to a certain degree. There's major figures that drift in, drift out. You don't get the handle on. But for me, anyway, the biggest fear when you watch that movie is CGI looks good of the test, but you don't see its consequences. You don't see what it did to Hiroshima. You don't see what it's done to Nagasaki. You don't see anything like that. It's almost, let's not talk about that. And if you're trying to, those are the kind of films that the next generation will watch and get educated from. And that's the worry. Obviously, there are documentaries and there'll be other films that capture all of that. But when you get a film that's a global phenomenon,
I was going to ask.
It's an easy thing to think, all I need to know is to watch that movie.
In Japanese cinema, are there depictions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Metaphorically with Godzilla.
Metaphorically with Godzilla.
That's true. That's true.
Yes, that is true.
It harks back to your question about moving on.
Yeah.
The Japanese moved on decades ago. They really have. To the point where you actually worry you've moved on too quickly.
Well, a final point about the artistic spirit of St. Petersburg, which somehow survived through the siege of Leningrad. They started making the film, The Siege of Leningrad, as the siege was still going on in 1942. And it's still available to watch. And it's a very stirring film, including scenes of absolute horror, but martial music and inspiration and statues of Lenin and watercolorists.
Well, I think it brings up this fascinating point that perhaps for those for whom it's most difficult to move on are the ones who won.
Yeah, but the big irony I found when I was doing the research over there was the American incendiary raids on Japan, far bigger than the atomic attacks. Dehouses 8.5 million people, kills nearly 1 million people. And the epicenter of that is the Great Tokyo Fire Raid. And you can go to Tokyo, city of 37 million, huge sprawling city. You won't find one commemorative plaque or statue that tells you 100 to 150,000 people died in one night. And luckily, I had a researcher who said, right, it took me 7 miles outside the center of town, down a back street, and we found this very touching statue of a mother cradling her child, because mainly most of the people that died were women and children. But then, conversely, you go to the States, napalm was invented at Harvard University. You won't find a plaque or anything that tells you Harvard invented one of the deadliest weapons in the Second World War.
But then in Berlin, the converse to Tokyo, Berlin, which suffered itself so terribly in 1945 as the Red Army moved in, but every street now contains some kind of historical memory. It really wears its history on its sleeve from the Holocaust onwards, from the Holocaust, the monument
but that
to
gets
the
back to memory and emotion.
Yes,
we
exactly.
choose what we want to remember.
But they remember everything, including the Checkpoint Charlie and Berlin Wall fragments they've got there, because the history for them is sacred.
Look, I have 2 pieces of the Berlin Wall that I got as Secret Santa gifts. So I think the commodification of World War II will keep things going. All right.
I know.
what-
Well, can I just say, if you go to Berlin, there's enough souvenir pieces of the wall to build a Great Wall of China.
Exactly.
So just careful what you buy.
And I think most of those were made in China.
Exactly.
All right. Why don't we open up? We got a question here. We got a question here, and we got a question here. Why don't we start with the front?
Thank you very much. That was a brilliant talk. I'm kind of convinced, but don't you think World War I was even more important? I'm thinking of all the treaties. You could say Ukraine was to do with Brest-Litovsk to a certain degree. The Middle East with Sykes-Picot. We had the former Yugoslavia. That's all to do with Versailles. Do you not think that was even more important in some ways?
I think you're absolutely right, and it also comes back to the theme of when do wars actually end? They don't end when people say they went. The First World War for Russia was supposed to have ended in 1917 in Brest-Litovsk, but of course it led into the most nightmarish civil war that went on until 1922. And again, it's in the middle of it, civilians suffering terribly, and that kind of thunder rolls right the way across Europe too. And the echoes of that war in the interwar years are kind of everywhere. As people coming back from the wars, the amputees, all the disabled men, all the casualties, all the families who lost all those millions and millions of loved ones, the shadow that hangs over the 20s and the 30s. And in the 1930s, the rearmament, and then the Spanish Civil War, as everyone uses this new theatre to rehearse the coming conflict. So in that sense, yes, the First World War
you look at the
doesn't end.
Pacific. I mean, at Versailles, Japan's pushed aside. It fought with the Allies, didn't get anything. It expected something. And then for the next 20, 30 years, that drives their resentment and isolationism to then slip, as Germany would do, into totalitarianism.
And anyone who lived under colonial rule in the so-called interwar period, and even hence, would tend to disagree that any war ended, like you had said before. But thank you, because I think you and my daughter have something in common as far as World War I being their favorite war. So.
And also, well, no one else can see this, but congratulations on your Bertolt Brecht T-shirt
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
I'd add that Bertolt Brecht, as so many people were fighting to leave East Germany and East Berlin at the time of the blockade, he made his way back in at the time of the blockade to East Germany, where he flourished with his theatrical career.
I think his compass was broken.
Let's go a question.
Yes, right here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting. I'll just ask the question about the long telegram from Arthur Kennan. Did that influence Truman's policy decision of more of a hostility towards the Soviet Union?
It then becoming a kind of overriding sort of philosophy. There's a containment, I suppose, the idea of containment. But again, it's all based on a certain sort of psychological depth, but also a certain psychological superficiality too. I mean, it's interesting to read it now, and interesting to read the kind of those who weren't completely.
Yeah, I was going to say that. There's doves and hawks. That's what swayed it in the end to a degree. I would say, I think Eisenhower was a bigger. He was, maybe it's because he was a military man from the Second World War and he'd been up close to the Red Army. I think he had his eyes more wide open than Truman had. So I think your question plays more to him as the president. But yeah, I mean, that fight between the doves and the hawks in the State Department went on all the way through those early years, right up until the Berlin Wall, basically.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Depends
important
you
to remember that George Marshall was Secretary of State at one time.
Yeah, and I was going to say, we haven't talked about George Marshall. I mean,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned him with that plan.
yeah, visionary, absolute visionary.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could talk about George Kennan too, with the whole policy of containment. A gentleman over there.
Thank you. It's a fascinating discussion, but it's been framed mainly in terms of national interests. I wondered how much you felt corporate interests were shaping the post-war history and the fate of international institutions now.
Well, again, the irony, I can only tell you what I was researching in Japan. The irony is the big industrial companies and powers in Japan that had fueled their militarism before Pearl Harbor and then obviously during the war, it was the exact same companies that got resurrected by the American occupational forces to rebuild the country. So that's deeply ironic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm trying to think of the something that would work as the opposite of that. So you have the American military-industrial complex, as identified by Eisenhower in the 50s and 60s, which still many believe to this day is keep the war going. I was trying to think from the other point of view, and Putin's use of natural resources, oil, for instance, to forge such close links with Germany that to become almost sort of inextricable. So it's not a corporate thing. That's again it's a national thing rather than a corporate thing, but it's still Gazprom ensuring that it has its foot on the neck of Germany. through Gerhard Schroeder sitting on the board of it and the Anglo-American
Yeah,
League. So,
yeah.
so I think it kind of works both ways, but it is a very interesting question.
Well, I mean, let's look at from the example the corporatization of military. Prior to World War II, I mean, FDR was engaged in lend-lease programs. But the idea that if you were going to war, you essentially were able to either stand or fall based on what you produced as weaponry. But the idea of weaponry then being sold on a relatively open market, and the idea of the arms dealers coming, I think the only arms dealer that I can think of prior was Kanusti Gulbenkian, who was this Armenian arms trader who actually became maniacally wealthy because he brokered the Iraq oil concession. 23.75% to the British, the Dutch, the Americans, and the French, respectively, and he kept 5% for himself. I mean, so you can imagine just how insanely wealthy he was. But that's the first quote-unquote arms broker, arms dealer that I can think of in world history. Now anybody can be one, and you saw particular, as you mentioned, with India, Pakistan. Here you have Rafale jets being shot by a joint Chinese-Pakistani venture. And the world is watching because these are those few moments that people can actually then see if their weaponry works. You can't do that at the Paris Air Show.
Yeah.
The French would object.
Well, it's true. I mean, it's also being said that in the midst of the current nightmare of the Ukrainian conflict, it's also a theatre of new tech in that conflict. The drone technology
that's
that's being
exactly- I was
used,
just- yeah,
and
yeah.
not just drones to attack people. They've invented a new kind of drone robot that can go into a battlefield and scoop up wounded men and take them out. There's all sorts of new things being tested out, as much by the West and Ukraine as by Russia. Russia, in the meantime, is deploying drones that are made essentially of balsa wood, but are still lethal. So you get all sorts of levels of tech going
in return for India buying Russian oil right now, there's Soviet nuclear specialists in India helping them progress to the next generation of their nuclear arsenal. And that's all going on under the radar.
Yeah. Okay.
But everyone's still trying to contain each other, I
Yeah.
think is the...
Okay. We have one here and then one back over there. So, yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. Which hotspot will be most significant? You've mentioned Ukraine a number of times, Middle East also. What you've not mentioned is Taiwan.
Well, we talked about it at breakfast, but then you were saying, Sinclair, that Xi seems to have disappeared off the public map at the moment. So we don't know whether he's ill with suspected cancer or there was
there was a
a
rumour of a heart attack, and also a rumour that they were seeking to replace him. But again, it's just absolutely impossible to know. But the Taiwan thing, I mean, the other interesting thing about the Taiwan thing is that, I mean, rather like the 1920s and the 1930s, it's having a war not just predicted, but people seeming to set it out. But I've seen whole sort of diagrams of when the Chinese army go in, this is how they will do it, and orders of deployments and all the rest of it. And they will seize the semiconductors, and the world's computer industries will seize up as a result. Which that's a James Bond plot, and also the difficulties. The reading also about the difficulties, even for one of the world's largest armies, to invade and hold an island as opposed to invading and holding other landmass territory. I mean, would it be a flashpoint also in Trump's America? I mean, I know that the whole he's trying in some way to end the Ukraine conflict so that he can then turn America's focus more to China and the Pacific. But are there other areas of the Pacific? Because the other thing we're saying is Taiwan is one thing, the Philippines is another.
But that's what I was going to say, the same thing. I mean, that's always been America's backyard. That's their primary interest. Even when Pearl Harbor kicked off, there was the Germany first rule, but it was always, but our main focus eventually is going to be the Pacific, and we're going to conquer
Well,
it.
this was the big issue during World War II. The State Department was actually replete with China firsters.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. And then remember, it was Trump that took the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But then Trump also recently told China that it can purchase Iranian oil without being sanctioned, as though, and I'll use this very loosely, he's the one to give the fatwa to do so. I would actually argue that probably the hotspots coming up that we need to worry about are the United States, the UK, France, and Germany, because I think that the domestic politics are going to be far more volatile than what we see elsewhere.
Yeah.
But that's a talk for a whole different discussion. Why don't we go last question to the gentleman over there, please?
I went to Shattered Lands yesterday. I don't know if you did. This was a new book which describes how the partitioning of the former viceroyalty of India in 1948, was it?
47.
47.
47 into 7 separate nations, which have been scrapping with each other ever since. And of course, Pakistan and India, the classic example. How frantically rushed that was. And that reminds me that my parents had a friend who was an Indian army officer in the 30s. And he told me that they expected to be running India for 50 to 100 years. So nobody had given any thought to, until 47, 46, to how to divide the thing up, how to get out painlessly for all concerned. So I suppose that's a legacy of World War II, this frantic departure of the colonial powers
Because
from
Britain
their
was
former
broke.
dominions and the mess they left behind because it was so hurried. Thank you.
Well, I mean,
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. Britain was broke, but also Britain had an ally, America, that was looking with very cold eyes at the British Empire and was very intent on dismantling the British Empire as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah.
Churchill, being the great sort of neo-imperialist romantic that he was, somehow imagined with his half-American background that the way could be smooth, that he couldn't see the empire dismantling juggernaut that was coming his way.
Americans love a garage sale and buying things on the cheap, and that's how they literally saw the world when decolonization was occurring. But thank you for that. Thank you for your questions, but more importantly, thank you Sinclair McKay. Thank you Iain McGregor. The books by Sinclair, St. Petersburg, Sacrifice and Redemption, The City That Defied Hitler. Iain McGregor, The Hiroshima Man, Quest to Build the Atomic Bomb, and The Fateful Decision to Use It. Both will be available in the festival hub in the tent. Signing books by Waterstones. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the discussion. Enjoy yourself.
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast with Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival, Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 12th of July 2026.